Madam Speaker, in closing government, we will extend this debate by talking about two specific stakeholders, the neighboring country and the refugees, and why this move will be better for both. We will extend on both those particular stakeholders' interests. But before that, 3 points of rebuttal. Opening opposition says, what if you, as refugees, disagree with the country you're entering? For example, Kurds in Turkey. Opening government already tells you that people like the Kurds won't go to these countries in the first place. For example, Kurds will go to Greece and not to Turkey. From closing government, we tell you, read the motion. This condition is for long-term asylum only. So you can still come in, get short-term asylum, and then determine where else you want to go without being forced to give military service in that country. Opening opposition then tells us, oh, you'll be put in the front line and you're not capable of fighting, right? We tell you, A, that's unlikely because it isn't in the army's own interest to send unskilled people to fight. We think it's more likely that you will be trained to be the nurses, to be drivers, to be engineers, to be cooks, which are far more viable options. But B, even if you are, it's important to recognize that the refugees have a choice here to work for the army or to seek asylum elsewhere and to live only for a short-term basis in the neighboring country. We think that's a valid choice. They haven't told us why it isn't. Third, they say, look, some countries don't take women, like Saudi Arabia, so you're discriminating against women in giving refugee status. Look, you can't strawman this debate by giving extreme examples. Presumably in those countries, our model will account for it by saying that the male member will have to provide military service to get his entire family long-term asylum. So we don't think it's a relevant argument. Now, coming to our extension on how this is going to be valuable for the neighboring country. Look, in 1979, Pakistan and Bangladesh were involved in an armed conflict, which caused 5 million refugees to flood the Indian state of West Bengal. India offered them long-term asylum with no conditions attached. Here's what happened. A, they crushed the economy by offering phenomenal amounts of low-skilled labor, which pulled down wages. B, this led to riots and violence between the locals and the refugees, and several hundreds and thousands of lives were lost, which resulted in an attitude of general hatred against these refugees, preventing them from ever integrating. Here's why putting those refugees in the military prevents this kind of economic crash and the sort of jingoistic hatred that it creates as a result of it. Here's why. A, for that period of 1 year, the refugees aren't competing in the local economy, which means the influx of the locals into the labor market is gradual and broken up into groups. Therefore, wages aren't affected to the same degree instantaneously because of a huge influx of refugees. Rather, it's broken down into segments over a period of years. B, the 1 year of service as refugees gives you valuable skills, whether it's in the form of engineers, nurses, and medical assistants. Look, opening government does talk about this, but they don't tell you how those skills are fungible and therefore have an impact on the economy. We tell you that those skills can be used in alternate fields of employment. So therefore, when you now enter the economy after 1 year of military service, you aren't directly going into low-skilled labor. You now have skills which can put you into different avenues of employment. So when you do enter the economy, it isn't at the lowest level, but in diverse sectors. So again, the impact on wages and the economy is divided. But finally, look, opening opposition says, they aren't going to, why can't they just go into government jobs? Why is that not good enough? We have 3 responses to that. A, they're still competing with locals for government jobs, which means they're still creating the kind of hatred we're talking about. B, the skills you're given in government jobs aren't as fungible as the skills you're given in armies. But most importantly, C, the symbolic effect of joining the army goes away. And this is a pure extension that no one has talked about so far. Look, refugees are often hated by locals because they're seen as leeches in the country. Opening government says we're changing that by making them productive. From closing government, we say we change that far better by making them look like patriotic heroes, protecting the country and fighting for its people. We think that's far more likely to change people's mindsets because people love and respect their soldiers. They have parades for them. They give them the highest pensions because they respect those individuals fighting on the border to protect their security. Therefore, from CG, we're the first team to give you an exclusive benefit of putting them in the army that does not exist when you're simply putting them in government jobs, which is why we think we're far more relevant in this debate. Why this is better for refugees, I'll take a POI from side closing.
So, it's true that people love soldiers and think that they're really patriotic. Isn't that a reason why people won't want people that they typically hate, CEG refugees, to be in their army and therefore won't take more refugees?
You need to be comparative here. People will hate refugees on both sides of the house. We think it's less likely they will hate those refugees when A, those refugees are being productive and they aren't stealing their jobs and they are not entering just one segment of the market, but B, and more importantly, when they are doing something which is valuable, which cannot be done by anyone else, protecting the lives of your people on the border by acting as soldiers. We don't think people will hate these refugees for entering the army. We think they will like them a lot more. You haven't given us analysis on why that always could happen. But finally, the second level of, or the second stakeholder in this debate, the refugees, right? We tell you the refugees are better off for two reasons. A, because they're more skilled and therefore they can be better employed in the neighboring country or elsewhere, and therefore they live better lives. But B, they face lesser hatred on the comparative, and there is therefore lesser violence. I'm not rating anymore. Lesser violence against them because they're now seen as national heroes who are protecting the country, and therefore the patriotism that exists in the country will also protect these refugees. Opening opposition says, look, they aren't capable of fighting, so you can't really put them here. We say, we're talking about the first year of armed service, right? What happens in that year isn't that you're handed a gun, put on the border and told to kill people. What happens there is you are trained. So even if the ultimate aim is to make you an armed combatant, you are given years and years of training skills, and all of that is developed, which means you aren't putting their lives at risk. B, they say, when the army fails, and this is seen, when the army fails, the refugees will be hated. You need to be comparative when you make this argument. We tell you refugees are hated already in status quo. Look at the attacks in Hungary. Look at the attacks in Poland, right? Here's why the hatred is lesser on our side. If the army fails, it can't be solely allocated on refugees. Therefore, the blame is more diffused. Therefore, the refugees are better off on our side, as opposed to all the blame being put on the refugees for the entire economy crashing because of them coming in and stealing your jobs, and because they simply work for lower wages because they don't have any other option. And B, people don't generally hate their army. When an army fails, you don't say, oh, those individual segments or regiments in the army caused this failure. You normally, because of the nationalist rhetoric surrounded around the army, you normally say, oh, our army was still great, they still did a good job, which now translates into the refugees. No one here has analyzed why suddenly the population will pick out the refugees and say, oh, these were the people responsible for our failure. So, A, because we create better security and a better economy in the neighboring country, and B, we protect the lives of the refugees far better. We are very proud to propose this move.
We'd like to thank the speaker very much for their speech, and now call upon the member for the opposition. Here we go.
Speaker, what characterizes the militaries in many of the conflict zones we're talking about in this debate is that they are hierarchical, they have long histories of abuse, but more than that, they have very limited government control and legal accountability. What we're going to show you at closing is the best place for refugees to be in this debate is not in the military. Those militaries are not providing the protection they need and often lead to abuse of those refugees. But more than that, this policy perpetuates a narrative that will lead to countries taking fewer refugees. So I'm going to do three things in this speech. First, I'm going to explain why refugees are likely to be abused far worse than some other alternatives that we're likely to present in this debate. Second, I'm going to explain why this leads to countries taking fewer refugees. And thirdly, I'm going to talk a bit more about how we best discharge our humanitarian obligations in this debate, standing on some of the material we heard from revenue opposition. So firstly, treatment within the military. Why is it the case that the treatment of refugees are likely to be awful in the militaries in these conflict zones? The first thing to say here is that the units themselves, the people that currently make up the military, are likely to be incredibly suspicious of refugees that are joining their military. That is to say, people in the military are often quite conservative, and often quite susceptible to narratives of xenophobia. But more than that, there are very realistic concerns about unit cohesion of many refugees simply being added into units. Military units, especially those that operate on the front line, like the opening government wanted to say in this debate, rely a lot on unit cohesion. They rely a lot on training. They rely a lot on people that they trust and they like. In that instance, we think it's entirely likely that people in that military will be suspicious of those refugees. Let's compare that type of suspicion, though, to a type of suspicion, no thank you, you'd have in a broader government or a broader refugee camp. Because we recognize that the comparative in this debate is between often refugee camps or other governments will have. think the widespread abuse that exists in the military is A, more rampant within the military than it is in refugee camps, and B, far less accountable. Why is that? That's because military accountability is something that's lacking even in the developed world. Special privileges that give them their own courts. More than that, governments don't like prosecuting their own soldiers. The very same patriotic narratives the opposing government wanted to point to. More than that, in times of crises, governments don't want to undermine this by consistently saying that their militaries aren't performing or their militaries are being abusive. In those instances, there's very little avenues for people who are abused or are mistreated by soldiers to actually get accountability. And it's especially likely to operate with minorities in the military, especially, for instance, gay people or women who are likely to be abused in those structures. The other thing about legal accountability compared to a refugee camp is that those legal accountability avenues are much more open. The United Nations provides lawyers, the United Nations provides observers in those refugee camps. They're far more likely to take the claims of those refugees seriously than the military is to take those claims seriously. But even to the extent to which legal accountability is occasionally lacking in these refugee camps, and we're obviously not going to say on this side of the house that the legal accountability is be perfect. I think it's far more likely those camps to be able to provide situations in which those refugees won't be in situations of abuse. You can segment yourself as women within a refugee camp. You cannot, as women within the military, segment yourself from male soldiers. No, thank you. But the other thing to note here is you're far more likely to get protection, because at the point at which you are a refugee in a refugee camp, you're not subject to the same types of military narratives I talked about at the start of this point. That is to say, what that side of the house is doing is not actually providing any immediate or short-term humanitarian. Oftentimes they're thrusting some of the most vulnerable people into situations of abuse. We think that's incredibly unacceptable on this side of the house. No, thank you. Second point is extension. This leads to countries taking fewer refugees. Firstly, one of the biggest concerns of all countries around the world is the concern of terrorism. We say that at the point at which you are putting refugees who people will perceive as terrorists in military units, they're entirely likely to think it will undermine their national security. Those narratives exist under the status quo, but what gives the rhetoric of right parties far more power is to say not only are we putting refugees who could potentially be terrorists in our country, we are training them and putting them in military units. The narrative of the patriotic heroes the opposing government wants to point to is undermined at the point where people think their patriotic heroes are being put at risk by refugees who they perceive to be terrorists. That means the type of narrative that exists around national security are far more likely to undermine the ability of countries to take refugees in the long term. But also, I'll take you in a moment, we think it's entirely likely that conservative military leaders who will oppose this policy on the grounds that it undermines unit cohesion, they don't want to take people who they think will undermine their national security, have a particular credence when they talk about issues of national security. The worst thing we could possibly have is Turkish generals standing up en masse and saying, this policy undermines our national security even more than they are now.
Okay. Great reason for opening government is suggesting very people who would end up running and constructing refugee camps under our side of the house will be refugees and military training. The military is corrupt and as dodgy as you think they are. They are the ones running refugee camps right now in Turkey. And your line of UN supervision is just not.
UN does have a lot of power to provide these camps. Because A, they are the ones staffing and providing these camps. It's not the entire case that the Turkish military would be the ones staffing and providing those camps. But I've already given you reasons to suggest why it's easier for you to segment yourself in refugee camps than it's been with people who are similar to you than it is the case in the military. But the other thing that we would note here about like whether or not it's likely to get abused, et cetera, by refugee camps, is there's lots of things that we could do on our side of the house to fix that. That is to say, we'd rather put the millions of dollars they're putting into training refugees to be military front lines and throwing them back into trauma, into actually providing money for people to police these refugee camps properly. At this point about taking less refugees, the issue of resources falls to our side of the house. Some resources to train a refugee to work in a hospital, for instance, or to work as an unskilled labourer. It takes far more resources to train them properly for a year to deploy them on the front line. I think people are far more likely to view refugees as being leeches at that point. The last thing I want to look at this point is part of the extension you heard from opposing government. The issue of whether or not who takes more refugees debate is an influx of refugees will crash the economy because there's unskilled labour. This assumes all refugees are unskilled. Many of the people fleeing these countries are in fact surgeons, CEG, Syria. Secondly, there are other ways to get skills. The problem that side of the house said is the skills you get when you work in a hospital aren't as fungible. We don't understand why, because the skills you get in military service would probably be pretty niche, like learning how to shoot an AK-47 isn't pretty useful for your life in Germany. But the other thing that we would say here also is outside of the house probably provides more refugees, and that's something that's beneficial. Lastly, humanitarian obligations. Why would you flee to a country that's you? this is about long-term asylum. So you have short-term capacity to choose what country you go to. Actually, many countries have a policy where you need to stay in the first country that you visit. That is, in fact, the UN's policy right now, which is that if you are a refugee in Turkey. But the other thing to note here is oftentimes we say that there's actually limited capacity to flee to other countries. Look, if you are surrounded in a siege in Aleppo, you are highly unlikely to be able to cross the country. And more than that, it's highly unlikely that it actually would want you to cross that country. We don't think refugees should have to take long, treacherous journeys. We're far more likely that those refugees actually go to countries and not be forced into military service. For all those reasons, we're very proud to approach.
Thank you very much, and now call upon the government whip. Here.
Madam Speaker, before I get on to answering the two questions that this debate revolves around, A, which side of the House better provides a better future for these refugees, and B, which side provides a better future for the host countries that we're talking about, a few points of rebuttal to what we heard coming inside closing opposition. First, they tell you that people in the military are going to be refugees. They point out a number of harms arising from that premise, such as lesser cohesion in the military or likelihood of abuse. We reject that very premise of a great amount of suspicion towards these refugees in the military for three reasons. First, let's look at the political leanings of these refugees, right? Because across opposition bench, we've heard the presumption repeatedly that these refugees are going to be viewed as enemies of the country that they enter into, with absolutely no explanation why. Because the kind of conflicts that these refugees are fleeing are the ones that they obviously do not have any strong political inclination towards supporting either faction, because otherwise they would be a part of that fighting rather than fleeing it. So we don't think that these are the kind of people who are viewed as national enemies, but rather simply as people who might place an undue burden on the economy, but aren't really affiliated with any particular political faction through where they flee. Kind of roles you're going to be put in the military, right? Because while the opening half of this debate did presume that we're talking about active combatants, we repeatedly told you that when you're put in military service for 1 year, it's very unlikely that you're going to be deployed on the front lines. You're more likely to be used as a cook or a technician or a nurse, or the sort of things that you can develop skills for in that shorter period of time. So we don't think this lack of cohesion in military units, or people thinking that going to surgeon group that will cause all military operations to fail is even a legitimate grievance in these scenarios. But finally, we tell you that they can't merely assert that refugees or immigrants are always going to be seen as terrorists, irrespective of what role they take up in the host country they're going to. We see this in the sort of narratives that are built in heavily immigrant-rich countries like the United States, where model immigrants or model migrants are often held up for performing things that are viewed as a particular ethnic group is seen as one that contributes heavily to, say, the tech industry, or is one that contributes to the military in those countries. They're often held up as model migrant groups that are to be valued and shouldn't be discriminated against. So we reject their black and white characterization, where every single country sees all refugees as terrorists, even when they are doing something productive or patriotic as serving in the military. Secondly, we hear that this is going to lead to countries taking in fewer refugees. Now let's look at the kind of countries we're talking about, right? We're talking about Lebanon, we're talking about Jordan, we're talking about Turkey, countries that border the Syrian conflict and have absolutely no choice or ability in the short term to stem the massive influx of refugees that do come in. Sure, we do agree that in the long term, questions are going to arise as to how we are going to rehabilitate these refugees, because there probably will be fewer long-term asylum applicants. But we think that's a good thing, right? Because it places pressure on countries outside of this region to take in a greater number of refugee applicants, especially because they are often countries that are far better off economically and have the capability to resettle these refugees. We saw exactly this happen in November this year, when Turkey and the European Union entered into an agreement to resettle refugees, because Turkey threw its hands up and said that they simply couldn't handle the millions of refugees that were crossing into its borders. It meant that EU countries now have to resettle a greater number of refugees. With these Western countries can turn their backs on these conflicts, because they also do have incentive to ensure that refugees are being handled carefully in these countries, because the moment they aren't, they will start flooding their borders and the crisis we're seeing today that those countries will then have to deal with. So we think in the long term, even if this does reduce the number of asylum applicants within these bordering countries, that's a good thing, because it more evenly distributes the duty that all countries have towards people affected by conflict. So on refugees, right, they tell us repeatedly through OO that, well, we're discriminating against people who are unable or unwilling to fight in these conflicts. We've told you repeatedly that there are a wide variety of non-combat roles in the military. So we think that most skill sets are accounted for. But on unwilling, right, we also told you that the reason these refugees have fled these countries is because of the belief that the national security apparatus in this new host country is better than the one they are fleeing from. We think that means, presumably, they are supporting the work of that country's military. Refugees are ordinarily not people who feel passionately for the groups that are fighting in those countries that they are fleeing from, because that is why they are fleeing from those countries. So while OJ did assert to you that refugees will be better assimilated, we told you structurally 3 reasons why that is more likely to happen, right? First, because you're cushioning the economic impact of a large variety of unskilled laborers flooding into your country. And we do think they're more likely to be unskilled laborers, because the sort of skilled laborers or people with college degrees are just going to take a flight out of that country and go to a European nation or to the United States. So we do think we're primarily talking about people who don't have those options. But second, we told you, they're viewed as patriotic. They're viewed as providing the most ultimate sacrifice that you can to the nations of the countries that they're going to, and that necessarily is a strong counter to the view of refugees as being leeches, as being people who might not be aligned with your national values. And finally, we told you, it benefits the perception of them, because now you have a limited number of refugees in the long term, and you aren't worried about these refugees flooding your country as a whole. Before you want to take over.
The most important question is protecting refugee lives. We give the Turkish military the perfect excuse to abandon refugee camps and let ill-equipped soldiers and former militants be wholly responsible for policing them. Are you willing to take that risk?
Let's look at the comparative, right? Does Lebanon have more incentive to take care of the people in the refugee camps, the millions of people in refugee camps across their borders, or more incentive to take care of the people in their military who are providing a national service to them and guaranteeing their national security? We think the answer is pretty simple. So finally, coming to how these host countries are affected, right? And while both sides did argue about how you're having either greater numbers in the army, but they might be less competent fighters, we don't really think this is about fighters, as we've repeatedly told you, right? But we think that they can specifically contribute in unique ways, since they do have knowledge and experience that only people from these conflict zones would. Because when you are fleeing a conflict zone, you have knowledge such as where a particular rebel base was, where the government is repeatedly carrying out airstrikes. And we think that unique sort of knowledge is something that refugees or people who are fleeing these conflicts can contribute to these militaries that people from those individual countries can't, right? So when they tell you that now these countries will not get any support for resettling refugees because they'll be viewed as having an evil policy, we don't think that's likely, considering all of these EU countries have also placed unconditional limits on the number of refugees they want to resettle. We think we provide the best lives for refugees and best ensure their assimilation in these host countries. We're very proud to do this.
Thank you very much for your remarks. And now to conclude the debate, I call upon the opposition whip.
Speaker, all of the government benefits in this debate are dependent on proving that you would necessarily take more refugees under their side of the house. We've proved to you that that's not true. Those benefits are also dependent on those people being willing and able to take those things on those countries agreeing that that is a thing that should be done, but it's also dependent on the false comparative that's been set up by the government bench in this debate, that we have to defend refugees staying in refugee camps ad infinitum. We think that the actual comparative is military service or jobs that refugees can do. We think that's a reasonable comparative to defend. 2 things I'm going to talk about in this speech. Firstly, why this disincentivizes states from taking refugees, and secondly, why this is worse for refugees. On the first, why this disincentivizes states from taking refugees. So what does government tell us as to why they think that states will take more refugees? OG tells us that this counteracts the narrative of like uselessness, that refugees are like a drain on the system. We would argue that this narrative actually just comes from xenophobia, and probably, even if you do one thing that technically counteracts that narrative, another narrative will emerge as a result of people actually just hating refugees and coming up with what they think are logical reasons to justify their xenophobia. We think that other reasons will emerge. We've told you what those reasons are. I'll touch on them again. We think those reasons are much worse than the encouragement of taking refugees, right? What CG tells us is that, like, well, now this was strange, but they were like, well, now they won't crash the economy because they'll now have skilled jobs. I mean, we would argue that lots of refugees are already skilled. We don't think it's true to say that like all people that flee from all conflict zones were entirely unskilled workers before they left. Like, lots of these people have qualifications that they gained before their countries became war zones. We think they could obviously contribute to the economy by getting a skilled job when they got there anyway. We don't think the military is necessary for that. We didn't really understand that argument from CG. But the next thing that CG tells us about patriotism is why the alternative narrative that we brought you at closing is actually going to be worse, and why it will disincentivize people from taking refugees under our side of the house. CG tells us that people are really patriotic, that they love their military and they love their soldiers. That's exactly why they will not want refugees to join their military. No, Kirby. Because they told us that, like, because when they hate refugees, and this comes from xenophobia, right? We think that it's just generally true that it comes from xenophobia, but also comes from the narrative that's been perpetuated globally in this refugee crisis, that it's possible that some refugees fleeing from Syria are actually just ISIS members masquerading as refugees in order to make their way into your country and trick you into thinking that they're real refugees and then like commit terrorist acts in your country. It's that narrative that means that when people are patriotic and love their military and recognize the good work that the military does in their country, that's the exact reason why they do not want people that they perceive to be terrorists or people that they perceive to be a threat to their country inside that military. We think that that's what people will perceive to be exactly what ISIS wants you to do or whatever. We think that's a really good way to make a policy really unpopular, right? We think that means that people, even if the government thinks this is a good idea, we think that it will be extremely unpopular with the people. We think it will lead to a huge decrease in taking of refugees when you force those people into the military. We think that's really bad. Lastly, on resources here, we just think that like it takes a lot of money to train these people. Tom told you this, and like we could obviously use that money for other things that are better. If you want to use that money to increase the capacity to control borders or refugee camps, we think that we can use that money for better purposes on our side of the house rather than forcing unwilling people to be traumatized in the military. I think that's really bad. The last thing to say in this point, and this is like touches on what CG said about Western countries turning their backs, is when we think what we think happens when this happens is it does allow Western countries to turn their backs on the states that are closest to these conflict states. We think it means that they turn their backs on funding border patrols, on transferring refugees. We think that means that when they think that they're using these refugees and putting these refugees in their military to do that, we think that allows them to turn their backs on those sort of things, that assistance is still needed with those things. It allows them to turn their backs on refugee camps. We think that's really terrible. Okay, second thing in this speech, why this is worse for refugees. No, thank you. So the first thing to say here is that the military is pretty terrible. Tom told you why that was. It's not just what our opening touched on, that like it's pretty traumatizing for you to have to like learn to fight when you've been in a conflict zone for a really long time. I think that's probably really bad for a lot of people, and they're not given a choice under this side of the house, which seems terrible. And it's not, and what we'll add here is it's not just like frontline fighting that was probably traumatizing for these people. It's also probably like learning to use weapons or like doing drills in the military that could be extremely traumatizing. Like we don't have to send you like directly back into Aleppo in order for the military to be traumatizing for you when you previously lived in that conflict. Like we think we still get to claim that. But the other thing to say is that the military, and I'll take closing in a second, is that like we took you already. The thing to say there is that like it's the structures of the military and the fact that often it's the most conservative people who are in the military means that the hatred and xenophobia that exists within society is likely to exist twofold in the military. Yes?
Explain why people are likely to be so xenophobic towards refugees, irrespective of what service or productive value they offer to those countries.
I mean, I already did explain that. So people already do hate refugees. Like, it's just a fact. I don't think you get to claim that the majority of people, or like at least a large vocal amount of people in the world, do not have xenophobia towards refugees. We told you why putting them in the military amplifies that a lot. I've already explained it. I'm not going to do it again. Okay. The next thing to say is like, well, so talking about military hierarchies, xenophobia is likely to be really strong there. And like they were like, well, it's also likely to be dangerous in refugee camps. But I just like don't think the comparative we have to defend here is like you're either in the military or you are in a military camp, in a refugee camp forever. Like we think that it's likely that as the OG model, that people will still be able to be taken in and get jobs. But that argument also relies on the fact that you wouldn't necessarily take in more refugees. We already proved why that's not true. The next thing that OG tells us under like why the military might not be terrible is that it gives you useful skills. I was like, well, like sure, if you think those skills are useful, then like you can like join the military, right? If you want to, if you choose that those skills are valuable to you, then like go for it. You do you. But like also, it's probably not great for you to get those skills if you're unwilling to learn them. Like if you're in a place where you absolutely do not want to be because you got traumatized, skills probably not super useful. Okay, the next thing to say is that this disincentivizes refugees from leaving. We think that it makes refugees stay in a dangerous place for longer because they do not want to fight. They do not want to have to go to countries and be conscripted to the military because they do not want to fight. That's why they're not fighting in their home country. That forces them to stay in dangerous places for much longer. That's really damaging, right? And CG was like, OG was like, oh, let's just go to a country that broadly agrees with them. Like sometimes they don't have that option, right? Like sometimes they have to go somewhere that does not agree with them. It would be lovely if they could. We just don't think that that's true. The next thing to say here is that it locks lots of people out, right? Our OG told us about like women and disabled people. The response that we get from CG is like, well, their husbands can join the military. We would like single women to also be able to be refugees. We probably thought they deserved the opportunity to do that. But it also meant that it sent the message that devalued women and devalued disabled people in society because it said that they were unable to contribute. That meant that those people just like would not get taken. That was really terrible. The last thing to say here is that it legitimizes the idea of conditional entry for refugees everywhere. This says that if you have a struggling in some sense, like your military is down, you can use those refugees to do that. Anywhere else, like Australia is really going to be really conducive to this narrative. They already do shit things to refugees. We thought that that meant that countries everywhere would be able to force refugees to do things that they didn't want to do in order to have entry. We thought that was a really bad narrative to justify. This meant that refugees wouldn't get taken and their life would be shit if they did.
Thank you very much, and I'd like another thunderous round of applause for all the